The measure of intelligence is the ability to change.
Hi all, Dr. Clark here again, and we're going to continue talking about principles of biology, kind of that underlying background of what it is that biologists do, or really what it is that scientists do. Okay? And so we're going to dive into how scientists think. Okay? And so there's a famous quote by Carl Sagan, who's an astronomer, who wrote, "Science is a way of thinking, much more than it is a body of knowledge." So when you look at science, I agree with him a lot when it comes to this. It's about, how you're thinking about an idea, not how much knowledge you can accumulate, but rather in a novel situation, how do you evaluate that novel situation? Or in a situation where maybe you're trying to discover something, what angle do you come at from, to discover that situation? Albert Einstein has a quote that's very similar to Carl Sagan's, in the sense that he says that imagination is far more important than knowledge. Right? Being able to imagine that you might be able to discover something, or imagine that you might be able to develop a project to test something. Imagine what might occur, right? To Albert Einstein was much more important than just being able to accumulate random facts and put them together. Okay? We'll look at more of the way scientists think, and we're going to practice how scientists think. It's a little bit different than the way that the normal general public thinks. And I think, as a scientist, that it's more valuable to go through the scientific method, to think like a scientist, in issues that maybe you don't know that much about. Right? And you'll see some examples of things in this course where you might have already formed an opinion on it, but once you go through the scientific method, you might have to change your opinion, because now the information, the statistics, the support is against your former opinion. And we'll look into these things. Okay, so science overall is a process of investigation, observation, experimentation, and reasoning. Okay. Now, that should sound familiar, and it will sound familiar to you when we look at the scientific method, because those are steps to the scientific method, is to observe, hypothesize, experiment, analyze, and then conclude. Okay. And that's, if you're a scientist, that's how your brain, after training, that's how your brain gets wired. Okay? Observe, hypothesis, experiment, analyze, conclude. Okay? Now, there are different ways at which you can approach the reasoning piece of it, that conclusion. Okay? In some cases, you can use deductive reasoning. Okay? And deductive reasoning is used by scientists. It's true. Scientists use deductive reasoning all the time. But deductive reasoning are principles or theories, hypotheses, laws that have already been put in place. Okay? They've already been tested. They've already been supported. And they eventually become common knowledge. So why do things fall to the ground when you drop them? That's pretty common knowledge that gravity, takes effect on that structure. Why do your tires heat up if you have to slam on your brakes? The theory of friction, and these kind of things are very simplistic to the general public now. Most people utilize them and utilize that knowledge every day. That's deductive reasoning. Right? It's already been put in place. The tests have already been done. It's accepted as the explanation. And so then people can just use it. Now, scientists often are the ones who are creating the deductive reasoning or the deductive reasoning explanations, those principles. And in order to create those principles, okay, or I shouldn't necessarily say create, it depends on what field we're talking about, but at least create explanations for those principles, okay? Develop those principles, discover those principles, okay? And they do that through inductive reasoning. This is a way at which you can discover those general principles, discover the principles that deductive reasoning is based on. Now, I'm not saying that while a scientist is developing a research idea, he's not or she's not utilizing deductive reasoning. Of course they are. Right? I mean, why recreate the wheel with everything? So if you're, trying to figure out, a scientific principle, but it uses pieces of other scientific principles. So maybe you're trying to figure out how to, combat certain diseases. So maybe you're using the theory of disease principle. Maybe you're using cell theory. Maybe you're using, other theory of evolution. Maybe you're using these other explanations to build into your test or your inductive reasoning. So that's kind of how I would say scientists work. Most of their work is in inductive reasoning and not in deductive reasoning. Okay? And so it's kind of this age-old thing that a lot of scientists like to say. And that is, I'm a scientist because I want to learn what we don't know. Okay? I'm not a scientist because I want to learn what we already know. Okay? So scientists don't get into this field to just talk about the things that they already know. They want to talk about things that they don't know, discover things that is not known to the world, and that's through the inductive reasoning process. That inductive reasoning comes with the scientific method. Okay, so that scientific method, again, will cover the pieces of the scientific method, but it's really important to understand where that scientific method is coming from. That scientific method has been put forth to eliminate as many biases as possible, to eliminate the input of outside sources, okay? To eliminate scientists being bought out by companies, okay? To eliminate poor scientific experiments, poor inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning explanations. Okay? So part of that is developing good hypotheses. And again, a hypothesis, for some of you, you've probably heard before that a hypothesis is an educated guess. Okay? It is not an educated guess. It's far more complex than a guess. A guess is basically implying that you have an individual that's not using deductive reasoning. They're not using inductive reasoning, okay? But rather they're just using a previous belief about something. Okay? And so that's where this hypothesis testing comes in. Okay? A hypothesis is an explanation for a natural phenomenon. It's not a question. Okay? So hypotheses aren't questions. They're not written in question form. They're not guesses. Okay? They are a set statement that is providing an explanation for a natural phenomenon. Okay? Now, we're going to look at the different stages to scientific investigation. And the great, or I guess you could say, the most interesting thing about biology is biology, because it's a study of life, and life is always changing, then in biology, we don't really have any laws. Okay, there's a couple laws we will talk about, but these are really mathematical laws based on probability. Okay, but in biology, majority of the things we talk about, the concepts we talk about, are theories or hypotheses. And the reason there's no law is a law is very different than a theory. A law is certainty. A law is saying that this will always occur. A theory is saying this is the explanation for that natural phenomena. However, it's always tentative. The theory of evolution, the cell theory, the germ theory, the theory of Mendelian genetics, all these are tentative explanations, which means that you can adapt them. You can adapt them when you get new technology that allows you to add to that theory. You could adapt them when you get new technology that makes that theory non-valid or a piece of that theory not valid. You can remove a piece of it. When it comes to a law, though, a law is a definitive answer to the question. And that's why in biology, there really are no laws that are strictly to biology. Now, again, there are some laws that we talk about in biology, of course. Law of thermodynamics, law of entropy, Mendelian segregation law. I mean, there's quite a few laws that we talk about in biology. But specifically to biology, no. They're theories. Okay? Because of this concept that biology is a dynamic science. It's always changing. Because the organisms that we're studying, that life that we're studying, is always changing. Right? Now, we're going to do this. We're going to experience this. We're going to practice evaluating science. We're going to practice evaluating experiments. Do these experiments follow the scientific method? Okay? Do these experiments conduct research without bias? Right? In order to do that, the experiments have to be designed around evaluating hypotheses. Okay? So let's look at the scientific process. Okay? 5 main stages that I like to cover. Now, again, it depends on the textbook, it depends on who's the instructor, it depends on a lot of things, how many stages are suggested in the scientific process or scientific method. Yeah. Now, you can break these into a lot of different pieces. Okay? Sometimes I've seen people teach 7 stages to the scientific method, even 8 stages to the scientific method. Sometimes 4 stages to the scientific method. It just depends on how you break them up. I like to teach 5 because I think it's reasonable and it's often taught that way. But that being said, you might see other stages, and I'll tell you where those stages could come in as we go through this. Okay, the first stage is almost always observation. Okay? Sometimes it's written question, right? But observation. So you're observing a natural phenomena. In the case of biology, you're observing something that has to do with life, because biology is the study of life. Right? So you have some kind of observation. Maybe you form questions from that observation. Maybe you had questions prior to the observation and then you observed. Right? But observations first. From the observation, you devise a hypothesis. Again, it is not a guess. It is not an educated guess. It's not any type of guess. And it's not a question. It's an explanation for what you observed what you observed in the first step, you're explaining how that could have occurred. You're giving an explanation for what might have accounted for that. Now, it's a tentative explanation, and often you have many hypotheses, but it's an explanation for that natural phenomenon. So, again, you might have multiple hypotheses, and most scientists would have multiple hypotheses. Because if you're truly doing science, you're making an observation about something you don't know the answer to. You're making an observation about something that no one knows the answer to. And then you're creating explanations for possibilities on answers that, might explain that natural phenomenon. So you might have to have quite a few different hypotheses in the form of alternative hypotheses. And then some scientists will have hypotheses that are called null hypotheses, okay? Which basically is stating that, look, we have a basic control hypothesis. This shouldn't happen based on deductive reasoning, based on prior knowledge. This should not be the explanation for the natural phenomena. That's often called a null hypothesis. Right? This should not be the explanation for the natural phenomena. But it's still stated because it's a control hypothesis. Just like your experiment's going to have controls in it, your hypotheses can also have controls in them. Testing. Okay? You're going to devise some kind of experiment. Now, sometimes between 2 and 3 is predictions. Okay? That you would develop predictions, if-then statements. Okay? They're often if-then statements that basically are stating this must happen in order for the hypothesis to be supported. Again, hypotheses are not correct. They're not totally accepted. They're not proven. They're supported. Okay? Now, if you say that it's accepted, you should be stating that it's tentatively accepted. Okay? Or it's tentatively correct. It's never tentatively proven. Okay? We're not proving anything in biology. So, you might have these predictions in between. Okay? But I like to stick predictions in with the hypotheses. It's part of that hypothesis process. Testing. This is devising experiment or experiments. These experiments are used to evaluate the validity of your hypotheses, the validity of the explanations for your natural phenomena. So experiments should be designed to test those hypotheses and not to test just random things. If they're just testing random things, then maybe you should have hypotheses about these random things. A huge part of experimental design is the use of good controls. Controls are very important. Controls allow for us to see what would occur in a normal situation, or what would we normally expect. And you can have lots of different types of controls. Maybe you're controlling for one single variable at each time, so you might have different controls with different experiments. Maybe you're controlling for all the variables, if that's possible. Okay, and then you'd have a overarching control that would control for everything. Okay? But controls allows for the design of what we call a parallel design. You're running the same experiment on multiple controls. You're running the same experiment on multiple experimental variables or experimentees. Okay? And then you're comparing it. It allows for you to compare using analysis, statistical analysis. Okay? So analysis is very different than just looking at the data. It's not enough to say, okay, this percent is bigger than that percent, therefore our hypothesis is accepted. No, that's not how science works. You have to utilize statistics. You have to utilize something that says, what's the probability that you would get this result by error alone? Is it 5% probability? Is it 25% probability? Is it 50% probability that you could get these results by error alone? That gives you a sense of how robust your experiment was and how robust your explanation for your natural phenomena could be. If you're sitting at, hey, 30% of the time we can get this by error, then maybe that's not a really good explanation, or maybe that's not a solid enough explanation. But if you're sitting at only 5% of the time you get this by error, in the case of biology, we'll accept 5% error. 95% confidence that this is the tentative explanation for that natural phenomena? Perfect. Okay. And the last one is conclusion. This is where a lot of individuals have a problem with, is concluding their experiment. Okay? A conclusion is not just writing whether or not your hypothesis has been rejected or tentatively accepted or supported or refuted. Okay? It's more than that. The conclusion means that you have to do something with it. Don't just do science for doing the sake of science. Publish it, present it, okay? Write a memo about it. Get it out there so people understand that this experiment has been done. There are so many scientists out there that do the experiment, and they get to this part, and the experiment was sound. They got good results, and it sits there and does nothing. So another scientist might come along and have a similar idea, a similar observation, but not know that there's already an explanation for that out there that has been supported with scientific evidence. Never proven. It's never proven with scientific evidence. It's supported with scientific evidence. Okay? It's tentatively accepted. It's a tentative explanation for the natural phenomena. And it's always should be stated as tentative. Because if more data, a different experimental design comes around, a little tweak here, a little tweak there comes around, then your hypothesis might need to be adjusted. Your explanation for that natural phenomena might not be accepted any longer. And like I said, report your findings, okay, through presentations, scientific writings, etc. Okay. This is huge, and it's often a last step that gets forgotten, or it just is allowed to sit there and nothing happen with it. Okay, and that's because this part, the report, the presentation, the scientific writing piece, it can be hard. It can take longer than the entire experiment. Far longer than the entire experiment. And there's many places in this piece, the scientific writing especially, there's many places in it for scrutinies, for checks, balances, for peer review that you might not enjoy, for editorial remarks, because your writing might not be as clear as you think it is. But that still doesn't change how important it is to report. All right, let's look through it. So here's your scientific method. Again, ask a question, identify a problem, do an observation. You're constructing a hypothesis or multiple hypotheses about that observation. Perform a experiment or multiple experiments to test these hypotheses. You're analyzing your data. You're analyzing your data with statistical techniques. You're not analyzing your data by looking at the raw numbers or just changing your numbers into percents. You're analyzing your data using statistics. And then you're creating some kind of conclusion. Is that hypotheses, or are those hypotheses supported? Are they unsupported? If they're supported, then you need to go back and do more experiments. You might need to go back and just repeat the same experiment to make sure that, it wasn't one of those 5% by chance errors. Okay, so you might need to come back and repeat that experiment to make sure of that. Okay. The other way, if it's not supported, you might need to construct a new hypothesis. Or maybe it's part of that 5% error and you should have another arrow here that says, well, maybe we should test it again to just make sure that our experiment was sound, our data analysis was good, and our conclusion is true, that it's unsupported. Okay? So let's look at some of the common problems. First of all, hypothesis is not a guess. Okay, we've already, and I just keep trying to beat this horse, and I really don't beat horses, but I keep trying to beat this into you. It's not a guess. It's an explanation for a natural phenomenon. There's no guesswork involved. Okay. Analyzing. Analysis is not percents. Okay. It's not raw numbers. It's not just a raw graph. Okay. It is statistical analysis using stats with either significance or correlations or, using indexes. Okay. This is how analysis works. Okay. Conclusions. Conclusions are not, the hypothesis is not proven. So these are some of those pitfalls. Don't say it's a guess. Don't say that you did percents and that's your analysis. And don't, in your conclusion, conclude that your hypothesis is proven or it was not proven. Don't use the word proven. All right, let's look at some of these. Look at an example of this. So let's ask this question. Why do giraffes have long necks? There's the question. You went out, you observed giraffes, and you're asking that question. Why do giraffes have long necks? Maybe you have been asked this question before when you're in kindergarten or first grade. Why do giraffes have long necks? Your explanation for that natural phenomena, for that observation, might be giraffes compete for food with other species of mammals. Perfectly good explanation. Giraffes have long necks so they can compete, reach up further in the trees, consume food. Okay? So there's our hypothesis. Note, my hypothesis does not have a question mark. Okay? This is also not a guess because this is completely testable. Giraffes compete for food with other species of mammals. That's why they have long necks. What's another explanation? Could be that giraffes use their long necks as a weapon during mate competition. Also, not a question. It is an explanation for why giraffes have long necks. Now, it might not be a valid explanation, but it's still a hypothesis, and it's still testable. Okay, so in order to test hypothesis number one, we have to develop some predictions. First of all, we have to know, is neck length variable among giraffes? So do all giraffes have the exact same length of neck? If they don't and it's variable, and certain giraffes have longer necks than others, okay, that's one of the predictions. That must be true. Neck length has to be inherited. Okay? There has to be genetic control over neck length, right, in order for us to test H1. Okay. Giraffes feed high in trees, especially during the dry season when food is scarce. Okay, that's a perfectly good prediction. So we can go out and we can test this. Okay. So let's say we did. There it is. Here's the data. Okay. This is feeding done at about shoulder height. That's most feeding. That's when where they're feeding at. So here, this first graph, okay, down here is feeding height in meters. Okay. The height of an average male sits at about 15 feet, or a little over 5 meters. They are feeding on average at about 3 meters, or 12 feet. Okay. We're not seeing a bunch of feeding way out here where the giraffe is stretching as high as they can or standing on their hind legs to reach way up in the trees. And we're not seeing a bunch of feeding here at the height of the giraffe. We're seeing it far below that, 6 feet at times below that. See the same trend with females. Average height of a female, a little over 12 feet. Where are the females feeding? Okay, somewhere around that 7-8 foot mark, okay, or 2.5 meters. Most giraffes feed like this. Okay? They bend down and they feed on vegetation below their height, okay, at about shoulder height. All right, let's test the other hypothesis. Giraffes use their long necks as weapons during mate competition. We would have the same predictions. Okay, again, it has to be variable among giraffes. You have to be able to inherit it. But this prediction would be a new prediction. Giraffes with longer necks will win more fights and gain access to more females.
If you think that giraffes are docile, think again. When mating rights to every female in 80 square kilometers are up for grabs, things can turn ugly. In Tanzania, a young upstart attempts to knock out the reigning champ with fighting tactics that shock nearby tourists. Nearly half a giraffe's height comes from its long, muscular neck, topped off with a head like a club, the perfect weapon for slugging your opponent. Some experts even believe their necks have specially evolved for fighting. And as their necks never stop growing, older males are the odds-on favorite. This 10-year-old is 30 centimeters taller than his younger rival. It's the champ who makes the first move, and the youngster retaliates, giraffe style. With his longer neck, the old bull aims a series of sucker punches. A solid connection could damage vital organs and win the fight. The impact can be heard 100 meters away. The inexperienced youngster retaliates. Ball and socket joints give their necks incredible flexibility, so they can fling their head like a slingshot. But to win, they need to aim for the body. For tourists looking on, it's a brutal display. These hardcore headbutts look like a dangerous tactic. But a male giraffe's brain is protected, with oversized sinuses acting like airbags to cushion the impact. For a moment, it looks like the fight is over. Like exhausted boxers, they stay close. But the young upstart doesn't know when to quit. For the old bull, enough is enough. With a well-aimed blow, he throws the challenger off his feet. The youngster concedes. He won't challenge again anytime soon. The old bull retains his title and his females. But other giraffes use a far more dangerous technique to gain the advantage over their rivals. Blood is pumped a whopping 2.5 meters up a giraffe's neck and into its brain. If this blood supply is cut off for even a moment, the giraffe could lose consciousness. A blow to the back of the head is all it takes. The contender is knocked out cold. He could be unconscious for over 3 minutes, vulnerable to passing predators. This time, he's lucky. He'll live to fight another day.
Okay, so there you can see that hypothesis number 2 is the hypothesis that we're going to tentatively accept. That's the tentative explanation for why giraffes have long necks, is that they actually use their long neck as a weapon during mate competition. And this is why we test hypotheses. For a long time, it was accepted, just because no one tested it, it was accepted that giraffes have long necks to reach high up into trees and consume food. Now, that might be a secondary benefit of having a long neck, although the data suggests that they're not actually feeding that high up in trees, that most of the time they're feeding at shoulder length. But that being said, we now understand that through evolution, the most acceptable explanation for this would be mate competition. Okay? All right, next time around, we're going to talk about the theories that unify biology.